Today, I am super excited to have Kate Adams, PhD, on the show. Kate is an internationally recognized researcher of children's spirituality. She spent a decade teaching children where she was deeply inspired by the insights they shared. Their narratives led to a path of discovery about children's spiritual worlds, initially through her PhD, which delved into children's dreams and sleep, which they believed had a divine connection. She's explored a range of spiritual aspects of young people's lives, and her current project focuses on adults' memories of their childhood imaginary invisible friends. Throughout her studies, children have often explained that their spiritual experiences and wonderings are regularly dismissed as imagination or simply ignored. Kate's work gives voice to them to help adults understand young people's inner worlds and appreciate the wisdom they offer us. Kate is professor of education in the UK and has published widely on the subject for over 2 decades through research papers, articles, books, including Unseen Worlds, Looking Through the Lens of Childhood, which we're going to be talking about today, and the spiritual dimension of childhood. She has served on the board of directors for the International Association for the Study of Dreams and is co-chair of the International Association for Children's Spirituality. Kate regularly gives talks on her research around the world for a range of audiences, all with the aim of bringing children's experiences into the light. Welcome to the program, Kate.
Thank you. It's fabulous to be here.
I'm so glad that we connected and I found you because, of course, that's what this podcast is all about: the wisdom children bring into this world, and of course, find our own inner child and that wonder and awe, and letting that live within us. So this is really exciting. I love when you talk about that your work values children and their spiritual world. And it's so, so important. So let's just kind of start at the beginning. Years ago, I know a little boy named Mark changed your course of life, or your career, actually, while you were an elementary school teacher. So, without going, we're going to talk about this the whole time. So, can you just tell us a little bit about what happened?
Absolutely. So I've been teaching in elementary school for about 9 years at this point. And I know the system is different than in the United States, but we teach religious education. And in doing that, we teach children about different religions and different non-religious worldviews. And we let the children explore those ideas. So we did this every year, and I often asked the children whether they believed in God or not. And we discussed lots of ideas, and every year very similar things would come up. So children might say they would hear God speaking through the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and so on. And then a boy I'll call Mark, one day he just said something I'd never heard before. And he put his hand up and he said, "Miss, I'm sure that God exists. And I know this because he talks to me in my dreams." And I was just, wow, in 9 years of talking about this with 8 and 9-year-olds, never heard anything like this before. And that really was a life-changing moment for me because it sparked something in me. And I went off and did a small piece of research and realized, of course, that the phenomenon of people talking to the divine in their dreams is in lots of scriptures around the world. But it's certainly not something one hears talking about. And I did a small project with children and found a fifth of them, it's only a small sample, but a fifth of them had said that at some point they'd had one dream that they thought had some kind of connection with the divine. And these were not all religious children either. And that then led to a whole chain of events that made me give up my teaching job and become a PhD student at the age of 35, where I packed everything up, sold my house, moved up to Scotland, and spent 5 years there studying with children about these special dreams that they thought had some divine connection.
Wow. And the beauty of children is they're so honest, it's not as if they would be making something up. How beautiful that as first you were an elementary teacher and then going on to do the work that you're doing today, how that is just interwoven so perfectly because you have the experience of looking into those children's eyes and really getting to know them. So you obviously have a very deep love and compassion for young children, for children, as I do. And how were you raised? Were you brought up spiritually or religiously?
Well, it was very interesting upbringing when I look back on it in that sense. My father was actually a scientist. He worked in a
Mhm.
analyzing chemicals. So he saw the world very much through scientific lenses. And if you can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. And my brothers and sister very much followed my dad. My mum was much more open to spiritual things. She'd been religious, she'd been Christian for a little while, but then that faded. Um, so perhaps I followed my mum by just being fascinated by those things. But you can imagine in a household like that, we had a lot of a lot of debates. And,
Yes.
I think yes, my siblings and my dad don't fully understand why I've made this my career, but
Right. It's so important, so
yeah.
incredibly important. So I want to, I know you've written quite a few books and papers, and today I really want to focus on unseen worlds. And why did you decide to write that? And what do you mean by unseen worlds?
So that was a book that as you know, sometimes you just have it in you. You just know, I've got a whole book here.
Yes.
I can see it mapped out. I can see every chapter and what needs to go in it. So it was something I was really compelled to write, to kind of tell the story really of these unseen worlds that children live in. So I call them unseen worlds, partly because a lot of adults just don't know about them because children are too nervous to speak about them because they think they'll be ignored or made fun of, or just not taken seriously. And yet I think there were worlds that lots of us as a child had access to, and many but I suppose they're thought of differently. So many adults, and actually some children, will just say it's just imagination, and that complicates the situation, I think, even more. So that unseenness is it kind of goes underground in a
Right.
sense, because children don't want to talk about it, and actually a lot of adults don't want to talk about their own experiences either. So it's unseen on many levels, really. And what goes on with a child? So, for example, if a child is in a dream world, we can't see that. We're reliant, aren't we, on the child telling us or letting us know in some way about it. So even if we can imagine what they're saying to us, it's still partially unseen. It's for us.
Yes.
We're observers, doing
Right.
our best, aren't we, to understand.
Yeah. Can you tell us a few of the stories? I know you had an audio clip, but you're not allowed to share that because of, the university but just tell us a few stories that what children have told you about their dreams.
Yes. So to be true to the children, I'll read out word for word some of the things they
Great.
said, rather than just paraphrasing, because it's just more authentic, isn't it? So there was a secular boy, John, who I talked to about a dream he had that we called it changing his behaviour. So he was telling me that at school he'd been getting into lots of fights with other children. And he said a few days after he had a dream, and he said, in the dream, I hurt a boy. Then there were lots of people from school punching each other, and suddenly I was lying on the ground. The boy I had the real fight with before I had the dream, he stood on me with one foot on my back while I was lying on the floor. He punched his fist high up in the air, like to say, triumph and revenge. And then I woke up. So I asked him why he thought he'd had that dream. And he said, well, I thought about it a lot. I thought it was a message from God telling me to stop fighting, because one day, well, the opponent might become the winner. So I decided to talk to the boy I beat up, and I made up with him. So the dream made me see that I needed to do that and change my behavior.
Beautiful. And
But
that may seem, well, it doesn't seem small to me, but that changes the direction of a child's life. When they I'm getting goosebumps, so I know it's true.
yeah.
You know, it changes a direction. It's like a whole new, it's like a fork in the road, right?
Absolutely, yes, literally changed him. And he was very honest. You know, he did say, well, I've tried not to fight since when I get angry, and occasionally he does, but he
Of
did,
course.
at least he was honest. But he
Yes.
did say he got in trouble much less. But I think one of the very interesting things about that, as you say, changing his life, was that, he was talking about this was a dream from God, and yet he wasn't brought up as a religious child, which was really interesting, and not the only child either who was in
Interesting.
that category.
I've interviewed PMH Atwater just to go off topic for a second a few times. She's become a dear friend. I love her. And she was saying, gosh, I just lost my train of thought. It was about dreams, of course. I'll go back to that. I'm so sorry. But she's just a mecca of information on the topic of, children and near-death experiences and those sorts of things, and has learned so much for that and how they can transform lives. So do you have another story that you could share with us?
Yes. This one was from Martin, a Christian boy, and we called this one The Importance of Family. And I think this is also a good example, because the dream itself is very, very short. And yet it was incredibly meaningful. So Martin described the dream as he'd had it 2 years before, so he'd remembered it very vividly for 2 years. And this was the dream. A man was praying on a hill, and suddenly he vanished. There was no one there. And then I heard a voice saying, "Never let go of anyone in your family." And that was the end of the dream. So I asked him who he thought the man was who was praying in the dream. And he said, "I don't know, but I think the voice was God." The day before, I'd had a big argument with my mum and dad. They went into my bedroom when I was at school, but I'd put a private sign on my bedroom door and they ignored it. I was really angry. So I wrote them a note saying, "If you come into my room again and don't admit it, I will run away." So I asked him why he thought the voice in the dream said, "Never let go of anyone in your family." And he said, it was a reminder of like your mum, she made you, and you'd be very unwise to go away from your family. I still remember it 2 years later, and I try to love my mum and dad more than I did then.
Oh, beautiful. So I just remembered what I was going to say about PMH in terms of the child that you just mentioned that was not raised religiously at all. And these are children that had near-death experiences, little ones like 3, 4, 5-year-olds. And two of the children in different families were raised, she used the word voodoo in voodoo, which there's absolutely no mention of God, religion. I don't, I can't say I'm know much about it, but just from what she told me. And this child, when she went to the other side during her near-death experience, she came back talking about that she had met Jesus, which and not, I mean, not from a religious standpoint, nothing to do, but just as a figure that, someone she met in heaven, which is very, similar to what you're saying, that they've never even known this, and then they have these experiences. Yeah. Wow. I love that story, the dream about the little boy who was having a lot of issues. His home was, I think, was a broken home, and he cried a lot. Can you tell us that story? That kind of pulled on my heartstrings.
It did with me, and it still does all these years later. Yes, Paul had a very turbulent family life, and he had a dream that he was going up to heaven, and he was crying. And I asked him why he thought he'd had the dream, and he said he thought that God was showing him that he was looking after him. But the thing that really, really got to me was when I asked him if he told anyone about the dream, apart from me, the researcher. And it wasn't uncommon that children would say to me, "No, I've never told anyone. You're the first person." But he just said to me, "No, I've never told anyone, only my cat, because he never laughs at me or answers back." And it was just that thought that a child had no person in their lives that they could talk to. And it was his pet cat who was just, yes, so meaningful to him.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes me so sad.
Yeah. And I remember correctly, he said that he's my best friend and he's the only one that won't like say it's not true or can't talk back or something like
That's right,
that.
yeah.
Oh, wow. So that brings me to my next question. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, as I heard you in an interview, you talk about imagination and a child's disappointment in adults. Um, can you kind of elaborate on what that means, and also the incredible importance of validating these experiences that children have, and listening really, listening deeply to them?
Yes, it's something that comes through not just my research, but research of my colleagues who also do things on children's spirituality, that children so often they're disappointed in adults because adults don't take them seriously,
Yes.
these kind of experiences. I think sometimes it's the adults don't recognize that they're meaningful for children. And adults are very quick to say, "Oh, it's just your imagination." And children find that actually quite insulting, because children know if something is imagination, and they will say that. Um, but often they say that these kind of experiences, they're actually very real.
Yes.
And Adults, well, they know who they can speak to. I think they know which adults will respect them and take them seriously. But this comes through actually in other aspects of my work. When I give talks, and I give talks to adult audiences, of course, and I've often had adults say to me, "But Kate, how do you know all the children in your research are not just telling you what they think you want to hear?" And sometimes I turn that question around on the adults and I say, if the research I've just presented had been with adults about their spiritual experiences rather than with children, would you be saying to me, Kate, how do you know these adults aren't telling you what you want to hear? So I think it partly says something about, certainly in Western cultures, what we think of children and how we frame children as, and yes, they do have fabulous imaginations, but we don't necessarily give them credit for these kind of very profound experiences.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Now, sometimes, in fairness to adults, they're just so busy. If they're not particularly interested in these experiences anyway, these things are very easy to miss. You can imagine a very busy household, kitchen in the morning, parent trying to get children ready for school and feed the dog and everything else. And if a child were to say something like, Mum, I had this amazing dream last night. If the mum's just conscious of time and they haven't got the time to sit and say, tell me about it. And I think the other thing is, so for example, the dreams I um, outlined to you, they are very short. You can recount them in 2 sentences. So in adults' busy worlds, it's just very easy to miss and not realize
Yes.
it was important. And it's the conversations you have afterwards, or you have the conversation around the experience. That's when all these real insights come out of how the children made meaning.
Yes. And I think it's so important to look to our indigenous cultures, some who in the morning, the first thing they do is sit in a circle and talk about their dreams and what those dreams meant. And that the children see that, they're important to them also. So that brings us to Matt, I'm sorry. The story of Matt talking about validation and parents being really busy. And by the way, this is nothing that, we're not saying anything badly about parents. I mean, we are all very, very busy,
Yeah.
but it's just becoming a little bit more aware. And before you tell us about Matt, I interviewed Lacey Borgo on the show a few times, and she's the spiritual counselor for a home where people who are homeless come and stay and this and that. And one little boy who was having so many problems, to paraphrase and make it brief, he was basically he wasn't, all the classes kicked him out of their classes, and so she had him sit with her. That's what I guess his his last punishment was to sit with Lacey during lunchtime. And she just talked about how they were both quiet. And I'll never forget, she said all of a sudden he just started talking and shared with me some of the beautiful things he said, some of the challenging things he said. And then she said, I just listened him to life. And it was so profound for me. If you listen someone, a child, or really anyone, to life, which basically means you're just looking in their eyes and you're deeply listening. We lost that, but I think you and I are determined to get that back
We are.
in this world. So tell us about Matt.
Yes, so Matt was an adult. He was in his 40s when I spoke to him. And this was the first time he told anyone this. And he remembered back to when he'd been a child. And he'd been at home one evening and he'd been outside in the the backyard. And there was a big kind of view across the land. He could see the horizon. And he said the sky was very sort of sky was really unusual. And he looked up and he said it was like a drawing of the houses in Jerusalem, and it was like a landscape in the sky. And he said this was not pictures in the clouds that lots of children look for. He said it absolutely wasn't like that. It was just like a line drawing. And he was just so excited. So he ran back into the kitchen and he said, Mum, come outside and look at this. Come outside and look at this. And she was kind of washing the dishes after dinner, and she said, yeah, I'll be with you in a minute. And he's going, no, now. And he ran back outside and it was still there. But by the time she came out, it had gone. Now, he wasn't too upset because he was just so excited about this. And this was a Sunday evening. So he knew that the next morning in school, and this was a Catholic school that was run by nuns. Every Monday morning, the nuns would sit the children down and say, tell us what you did at the weekend. So he thought, I'm going to tell everyone about this. This is so exciting. And his words to me were that he told them that story. And he said that was the worst thing that he'd ever done. And I said, well, why? And he said the moment he told them about this vision in the sky, he said everyone, all the other children in the class and the teacher, who was a nun, he said they burst out laughing. And he just felt so utterly humiliated that no one was going to take him seriously. And although he is a religious person, he retained his Catholic faith as he moved into adulthood. But he said he'd never told anybody since, until he told me and gave me permission to tell people about it. And I think that's one of many instances where we see this potentially negative impact that literally lasts a lifetime.
Yes.
And it's just so sad, but equally it tells us how important it is that we listen to children while they are children.
Right.
And even if we don't believe them, and we're not asking everyone to believe, if a child says they see an angel, we're not asking everyone to believe that there is an angel. They might not believe in angels themselves. But it's about, as you say, validating and just listening and respecting what the children say.
So let's talk about angels.
Let's talk about
That was my next question. What if children told you about angels? And before you answer that, what are generally what is the age range of the children? Because from my research, usually around 6 or 7 is when they, start not having as many of these experiences. What is your experience?
Yeah, that's interesting. I did a study with 4 to 11-year-olds. And some of those younger children were saying things like this. And other work I've done has been mostly 7 to 11-year-olds. And I think, although we can't be sure, I think these experiences do carry on, but they become, around the age of 6 and 7, they become much, much more aware of peer pressure.
Yes.
And people not taking it seriously. So I think there's a lot more out there that we don't really know. I mean, I had children themselves who'd they'd agreed to take part in the research, and their parents had given permission for them to do so. But one or two of them backed out at the last minute, and they'd said to their teacher, "I really want to go and talk to that lady, but if I go out of the classroom and go and see her, my friends are going to know. So I've changed my mind." And you know,
Yes.
that real fear. But I think very young children, yeah, as young as 3, 4, 5, who are perhaps less aware of that.
Right.
So they will tell us more. Because at that young age, you think that what you see, everyone else sees, and until
Right.
someone tells you, actually, no, we don't know what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. I was, before we get to angels, I was doing a small ritual with, which that's a new project of mine where I'm
Mm,
working with children and families with rituals. And I was with, interestingly, a 2.5-year-old and
mhm,
I think her sister was 6. And the 2.5-year-old was, she was really scared of being left alone and would see monsters. And it was so beautiful because the ritual is all about not only validating, but letting a child know that we are all here anytime
mm.
to help you, to be with you. Even if we're not here physically, just close your eyes and, think of your sister, or think of your puppy, or think of, and the 6-year-old, it was so perfect. She goes, well, what I do, I just close my eyes and I clap my hands and gold just appears all around me. And her little sister was, I mean, she was only 2.5. She was pretty articulate talking about these and
Absolutely.
this little sister was looking at her, and you could just tell, I know that will help. She just smiled, and later they hugged, and it was just so incredibly beautiful. So when they're that young and just so open, for them to validate one another too. Yeah. So tell us a few of the stories about what children have said about angels.
Yeah, yeah. These are really interesting. So I spoke to a little boy called Jonas who was 7, and it was interesting because he used the word fairy and the word angel
Mm, yep.
interchangeably, which was the only time I've come across that. But it was nice. But so he was 7, but he remembered back to when he was 5 years old, and he and his sister had gone out to his cousin, sorry, had gone out to the local park, and his cousin was 16, and he said he saw this winged creature who was pretty big, and she had white wings and silver shoes on, silky shoes. And she, well, as soon as we saw her, she went straight back up to heaven. And she was there for like half an hour. And he said that she spoke in a very gentle voice, but he couldn't remember the words that she'd said, because he said, well, I can't remember because I was only 5.
How sweet. Now that's honesty.
It's great, isn't it?
Uh,
And so we see children like Jonas who say they see angels while they're awake, and the traditional guardian angel um, near their bed. But children also see angels in their dreams sometimes as well. Um, so Samantha, who was 10 years old, she had a little pet hamster called Hammy. And Hammy had been ill, and her dad said, he was going to have to take Hammy to the vets, and
mhm.
so Samantha was upset, but she said she had a dream, and an angel appeared in the dream and said to her, Hammy would be happier, and he will be looked after well, and he wouldn't feel any pain or any
Mm.
So Samantha, at the age of 10, she knew that Hammy wasn't going to survive, the trip to the vets. And she knew that before the dream. But she took comfort in the angel's words, really. And she said, well, I felt happier because I knew Hammy would have a happy life after his physical death.
Yes.
And she said what the angel said had helped prepare her for his death in a nice way, was the way
Oh,
she described it. And the other nice thing about that was it helped her support her. She had a younger brother and sister who weren't really old enough to fully understand. And she said it helped her help them sort of
yes.
deal with his death.
Yes. We could learn a lot from her, right, as adults on how to help the young ones.
Yeah.
And then, of course, so many children see deceased loved ones. I mean, I have interviewed so many who the children, one little boy, the uncle had passed, and he was talking to his mom about it. And he said, he didn't die. He's in my room, or talk about grandparents. And I know, I think it was a little girl that saw her Nana and about the cup of tea. Can you tell that story?
Yes. So that was in a dream, and
It was Katie seeing her Nana.
yeah, and these are lovely because, again, sometimes, as you've just said, it happens when they're awake. Sometimes
Yes.
in a dream, and the nana would always sit at her table with a cup of tea, and Katie didn't like tea, but she knew that her nana did. So yeah, one night there was a dream that she was there, and again that just made her feel better, which
Yeah.
was nice. Um, and there was another one I found really interesting. Amy, who was 10 years old, and she'd had a dream again about her grandmother who'd recently died. And she said, my grandma was on the bus going down the road, and she was telling me before the bus started, she was telling me that she was only going away on holiday and I would see her again. And then she was just away on the bus. So again, a fairly short dream, but she thought that dream again was a message from God telling her that although her grandmother had already died, that it was the bus journey was a symbolic
Yes.
journey, and that she knew that when she died, many years in the future, hopefully, that she would see her grandmother again in heaven, which was lovely and gave her kind of peace as well.
Beautiful. The travel narrative is very, very interesting. Lisa Smart, who works with Dr. Raymond Moody, she wrote a whole book on this. She's a linguist, and my mom even did this about getting away from dreams for a second. She always talked about getting on the bus, and right before she passed, getting goosebumps again, she goes, I think it's about time to get on that bus. And Lisa, I never really thought about it until I became friends with Lisa and I read her book. And there's so many, so many stories and examples of that. But the important thing here, I think, is I'd like to get your opinion is it's very much like near-death experiences. It's about past lives of children talking about past lives. We have so much to talk about that we can't get to today. Yes, yes. Yes, there are these really interesting stories, and they cause us to take pause. But many times they really transform children's lives. I mean, forever. Once again, it's kind of like that. And that is the important, I mean, it's all important, but that's so telling of the validity of it, truthfulness, don't you agree?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
it's that long-lasting impact that, and this is why it's also important, I think, to hear adults' narratives of their memories, because we then know how long an impact it has had. And yes, it can shape a person's entire worldview for their whole life and guide them. And it's
Absolutely.
so phenomenally important.
Yes. Yes, so important. So I also believe that these spiritual experiences that children have, and as we begin to validate and listen more deeply, that it really builds an inner strength in a child. So they have some place to go when maybe
Mm.
they're feeling lonely or they're scared or they're whatever it may be. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things I've found is that how children make meaning of these things doesn't always connect with the upbringing they've had.
Yes.
And as adults, we mustn't assume that because someone has been brought up in a particular religious tradition, or they've been brought up with no religious tradition, that they will follow automatically their upbringing, because they don't seem to. They can, I mean, academics call it hybridity, where people can take a belief from one thing, and a belief from another system, and sort of mix and match and whatever. So not to take these things for granted, that they will necessarily follow the beliefs and systems of comfort that they've been brought up in. Um, yeah, they have their own agency,
Mhm.
and we can't always work out how they've come up with those ideas and so on. And perhaps it's not for us to know. Really, I do think a lot of it sometimes is a child's kind of inner knowing and intuition.
Yes, yes. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Having
Yeah.
an inner, it's like us as adults, what, 50, 60, we finally start meditating and doing, well, the new generation is much, the new generation is much better at it. But, and we have this deep knowing now, and it brings us so
Yeah.
much comfort. But if that would happen when you're a child, oh my gosh. I mean, how beautiful. So hot off the press, I know you're doing some research on imaginary friends. You and I have chatted about this a little bit.
Yeah.
And do you have any great stories, or are you just diving into it right now?
So yeah, just opened a survey, an online survey recently,
Mhm.
and collecting adults uh, who have strong recollection of.
Yes.
Now, I've said imaginary stroke invisible
Companions, I heard.
companions
Yes.
from childhood, because I think one of the interesting things is most of the research on imaginary stroke invisible companions is by developmental psychologists who've found out lots of fascinating things for us. But they largely just assume all these experiences are literally imaginary. The children create them as part of their pretend symbolic play, and the children know the difference between fantasy and reality. And most children will absolutely say, yes, I made up my imaginary friend when I'm bored, or to help me, etc., etc. But there are children who say they're not imaginary. And there are adults who say, even now, you know, they might be in their 50s or 60s, that they remember those friends or companions as clear as day.
Mhm.
And they will say, you know, their parents at the time, many years back, just thought it was an imaginary friend. And they say, no, it's absolutely real. They can't explain them.
Yes.
So what I'm trying to do through my research is collect information, collect narratives from adults um, through an anonymous online survey. But if people want to follow up interview as well, then they're welcome to leave a contact email. And I'm interested in all different kind of cultural perspectives.
Yes.
So although I'm looking at a comparison between people who were brought up in the UK and in the USA, because that's where most of this research has taken place, I'm fascinated by different cultural views. Some cultures don't have a concept of an imaginary friend, and yet their children see invisible people, and they will frame them more as the ancestors, for example, or
Right.
traveling companions, or spirits from another world. And that language doesn't appear in all the Western developmental psychology research. So I'm
Yeah.
fascinated to hear about adults' experience.
Yes. That's interesting because other cultures, when they use those words, it's absolutely a form of validation, right? The Western world doesn't even use those words. And I find it, I mean, of course, developmental psychologists are hugely important and so knowledgeable. However, sometimes, once again, it's so much like near-death experiences, as Dr. Bruce
Mhm.
Grayson says, is that sometimes the anecdotal, the stories, that's what you have to listen to, you know? And
Absolutely.
I think that's where we're getting to at this
Yeah.
research with children. It's like, yeah, I can, I have all these resources and all the, footnotes and biographies and
Yeah. Yeah.
but let's just talk about the stories and how when you're looking into their eyes and maybe the tears and maybe the joyful giggle or whatever it might be. So as you gather all of this research and what I'm doing, yeah, I think that's really important. So we need to probably start winding it down here a little bit. Do you have any other stories or anything that you would like to share with us? I do want to. Have you hooked up with Leslie Lupo yet?
No, but I will
Oh,
be.
okay, okay. So I need to talk to you about that because Leslie Lupo, I encourage my listeners to go back and listen to her
Mhm.
story about her profound. It's really profound. That really shouldn't be. You don't need really with the word profound, but it is really profound. And about during her near-death experience, she was met by the beautiful woman that she remembered as a 4-year-old, I think it was around 4, small child when she was romping in the garden with her grandma. And she called her the blue lady because she was surrounded, which you hear this many times, is the
Yeah.
etheric blue light, around her, and how her grandma, she was excitedly telling her grandma, and her grandma thought she had a spot of sun or so. I can't remember the terminology. It was so cute. And so put her hat on and gave her a cool glass of water. But Leslie explains this so well. And there she was. She was one of her spirit guides. Yes, there was one of her spirit guides there with a lot of knowledge and a lot of information. And so that's a really great story. You definitely need to hook up with that. But anyway, back to do you have any other stories, or I would love to. Do you have any other stories?
I think it's important to say that everything we've talked about this evening has just been, really comforting and life-changing experiences. And that's so important. But we also have to remember that occasionally some of these are quite frightening. So I
Yeah.
had a dream told me to me by a boy who'd been brought up as a Christian. Um, but he actually reported a really frightening nightmare. Jesus was on the cross, and he could see in graphic detail the blood, and
Mm,
so on. And it had sort of troubled him.
yes.
And sometimes in when we write about children's spirituality, we talk about dark spirituality. By that we mean when a child is frightened, and just so that adults are aware, just so that we can support
Right. Right.
children. But that doesn't take away, I think, from absolutely the majority of experiences
Mhm.
are very, very comforting and bring joy and happiness or new insights.
Mhm.
Uh, so yeah, I just think that that's important to think about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. From my interviews, once again, many have told me that when, of course, we all want everything to be comforting and light and lovely and happy, but when that basically God or the divine would never send something that is more of your mind making it up. Maybe something had happened, or maybe had heard a story at church or school or this or that. But who knows what is true? The important thing is that we validate, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
that we validate. So thank you.
Yeah.
That is a very good point. So what are your words of wisdom? What can people do that are sitting here or listening and just thinking, oh my gosh, I need to validate my child more. I need to listen more. I need to ask him about these angels. Or so what do you suggest to adults? Because I'm sure you get those questions a lot when you talk with groups of caregivers or parents.
Yeah, well, I mean, you hit on one of the statements very early on in the interview about, I think, us becoming back like a child,
Mhm.
when we just saw everything with wonder and curiosity, which a lot of us lose in the busy day. So I think it's about making time um, to watch carefully, particularly
Yes.
with young children, um, who might not have the verbal articulation yet, but they seem, maybe perhaps they're interacting with something we can't see, that something is going on. Listen carefully, without trying to impose our own personal views onto something.
Yes.
Um, I think we also do have to remember, of course, and some children have said this in research, when we say, have you told anyone about this apart from us, the researchers? And they say, well, no, I haven't, but that's because it's private. So sometimes
Mm,
they don't want to. And we just need to be just mindful of that a
yeah.
child might not want to share. But I think my final piece of advice really actually comes from a child in my research, which was quite interesting. So he told me about an experience, and I said, "And have you told anybody?" And he said, "Well, I would have told someone, but nobody's ever asked me."
Oh my gosh, bless his heart. So, Kate, if you could take a walk with your 6-year-old self,
Mm.
what would you say?
When I was 6, I was very, 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 very shy and quiet.
Mm,
But I loved all these things. I loved going to bed to dream and sleep, and I love the idea of ghosts and the supernatural. So what would I say to my 6-year-old self? I would probably say, trust your intuition.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So important. And if we would learn to do that at a young age, wouldn't life be much more interesting?
And I think it would make us a lot stronger inside as well.
Absolutely.
We really trust our intuition.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has just been a delight and an honor. And if people want to find out more, find information about you, how would they do that?
Yes, you can contact me on my work email, which is K, that's just the initial K, full stop, Adams at leedstrinity.ac.uk. And
Great.
as long as the email doesn't get caught in the spam filter, I will reply. And I'd love to hear from anyone who's
Wonderful.
it'd be wonderful. And thank you so much. I'm so glad to have met you, that you found me. Uh,
Yes, I am too. Well, thank you so much, Kate. And all the information will be in the show notes too, if someone, wants to check those out. Well, thank you. Thank you. A big hug to the UK,
absolutely.
and you have a great rest of the evening, I guess it is there in the
Yeah.
UK. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Thank
Marla. Bless
you.
you.